About 20 years ago, the West Coast groundfish fishery collapsed due to overfishing. It included many popular species like sablefish, flounders, skates, and sanddabs. And the resulting closures of hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean was a financial disaster for fishermen.
That was pretty devastating for the West Coast fishing communities.
In response, the fishing community, scientists, and regulators came together and made a plan. A recovery effort that, through sacrifice and compromise, has largely been a success. And today, many stocks have been rebuilt and are fished sustainably.
We do have one of the best ecological comeback stories, but it's not yet an economic success.
This is Dive In with NOAA Fisheries. I'm John Sheehan, and today we'll hear about this decades-long effort to get West Coast groundfish back onto plates. My guest is Jana Hennig, the executive director of the nonprofit collaborative Positively Groundfish.
Our main mission is to re-stimulate market demand for underutilized but very sustainable West Coast groundfish species. That's things like rockfish, Dover sole, petrale sole, lingcod, black cod. It's about 90 different species that fall into that species complex.
Positively Groundfish is a NOAA Fisheries partner and a recipient of a Saltonstall-Kennedy Grant, one of NOAA Fisheries' funding mechanisms that supports U.S. seafood. I wanted to know just what happened to groundfish 20 years ago.
Well, overfishing and depletion. So if I back up a little bit, groundfish was probably the most staple fishery out here on the West Coast. You could fish it almost all year round. And, rockfish, for example, was the white fish out here on the West Coast. If you got a fish and chips or a fish taco somewhere, it was very likely that that was a rockfish. And during the 80s or so, it probably had its absolute heyday. But after that, the stock started to decline quite rapidly and bottomed out sort of during the 90s. And then by the year 2000, the fishery had kind of collapsed and was declared a federal disaster. And so it was shut down in the year 2000, 2001. That was pretty devastating for the West Coast fishing communities.
So how did they bounce back from it?
Well, it was a tough time for sure. And there was definitely plenty of people who were angry about it and left the fishery. They might have taken their boats up to Alaska instead or retired altogether. But those that stayed were completely committed to figuring out how to turn this fishery back around and get on a path towards sustainability. And fishermen and scientists actually came together to figure this out. And to this day, it's a pretty collaborative environment over here on the West Coast. So a whole host of measures were implemented. The first was a radical reduction of the fleet size. The groundfish fleet was over 500 vessels, and it was reduced down to below 100. One of the main contributing factors to overfishing beforehand was that we had overcapacity. We just had too much fishing capacity for the stock that was out here. Then a whole bunch of closures, geographical closures, rockfish conservation areas were implemented, seasonal closures. Then, of course, all kinds of gear modifications were put in place. Longer foot ropes, gear that is more selective, radically reducing the amount of bycatch and discards. And one of the big contributing factors to overfishing was that we simply didn't know how much groundfish there was, or really understanding the biological behavior of a lot of the species in the complex. And so there was a lot of investment in science, in better, more accurate stock assessments, more frequent stock assessments, and sort of also an understanding by fishermen that science is absolutely necessary if you want to have better science, which then reduces your uncertainty factors, which actually means you have better quotas in the end. So that's been a huge contributing factor to getting back to sustainability.
And that's such a great success story, too, of communities coming together with the scientific community, with government, and everyone, making some pretty significant cutbacks, but leading to a rebuilt fishery.
Absolutely. I'm not going to say that it wasn't without pain and that there wasn't a lot of discussion and arguments over how exactly things should be implemented. But overall, there was a joint and mutual commitment that we want to get the fishery back on its feet to a point where we can fish it again. West Coast Groundfish was one of the pioneers of the IFQ, individual fishing quota.
A quick note here. Individual fishing quotas are a kind of regulation, putting a limit on the amount of fish an individual can catch.
Again, painful to begin with, but it does mean that we have a system out here on the West Coast now where there's full accountability. We record data meticulously, and that goes hand in hand with us having 100% observer coverage. In fact, they call it 200% observer coverage because there's one on the vessel and one on shore as things are landed.
Okay, one more thing. Observers are independent monitors that verify and quantify catch aboard fishing vessels. And actually, they do way more than that. But suffice to say, they're very important to ensuring sustainability. And it's pretty uncommon to have observers on every vessel.
That system of accountability and tracking and compliance for all of the rules, and it's what gives consumers trust that we didn't just bounce back now, but we're going to make the same mistakes again. No, we're not.
Absolutely. And here we are today with a rebuilt fishery. So why aren't consumers clamoring for more?
It's complex. We do have one of the best ecological comeback stories, but it's not yet an economic success. What happened when the fishery was shut down, it meant that over the next 10 years or so, we lost a lot of fishing capacity and processing capacity. And with that went a lot of infrastructure as well, especially in California. And that puts us into a position now that it's really a chicken and egg kind of situation where you can't have fishing vessels coming back in to fish when they don't have a processor to sell it to. And you can't have a processor coming in investing millions of dollars in a facility when they don't have vessels bringing them fish. And everything has to restart from a small scale space and kind of grow organically back into something larger scale. From a market perspective, being off market for 10, 15 years meant that, our species were no longer in the fish case, were no longer on the menus. And it coincided with the rise of low-priced species from Southeast Asia, like tilapia, swai, and they were replaced. When consumers don't see it on the menu or in the case for a long time, it just means they forget about it. And what makes it even harder, I would say, is that at the same time, market demand is low, but as stocks are rebuilding, it means that supply is ever increasing. And when supply is increasing, but demand is not, that puts downward pressure on price. But at the same time, costs have increased substantially for producers, for the vessels as well as the processors, right? And on top of that, because volumes are so low, they don't have the economies of scale anymore. And so the cost per pound harvested is also high. So we have, economically speaking, a triple whammy of high costs, low volumes, and low prices in market. And that means almost nobody has money left over to reinvest in the fishery. The fishing capacity, the processing, the infrastructure, nor in the marketing. And really the marketing is the one thing that could turn this whole thing around. Because you're not going to affect the cost base very much, but you have to affect the price in market by differentiating your product, and you want to drive up the volumes that you sell so that you can have better economies of scale.
It's the one thing you can control.
It's the one thing you can control. It's the one thing that can turn this around into a positive feedback loop. But it's the thing that nobody has money for.
Yeah. And it's so counterintuitive because you would expect, it's a local product that had historically been so popular. It's this delicious fish that's sustainably caught. Of course it'll do well. But as you just illustrated, it actually is really hard for various market forces. So what do you do? What actions can you take? What's your strategy?
The first thing we do is research, market research. I personally believe it's incredibly important that we understand the consumer and key market keepers, gatekeepers like fishmongers, chefs, etc., that we understand them much better than we currently do. We found that, yes, awareness levels are pretty low. Even lower than that, though, are what we call trial, meaning you have actually eaten it at some point and you know whether you like it or not. You've tried it. And trial levels for our species were typically about half of the awareness levels. So that's a big, big drop-off between people who know that a rockfish exists and have ever actually eaten it. And when it comes to food, having actually eaten something and knowing whether you like it or not is absolutely key to getting a sale. So we decided to do like a big sampling campaign, so to speak. And, we built a little mobile kitchen, and we would go to lots of events, whether they were trade shows aimed at chefs and retail buyers, or, public events and just sampling to the public. And we would make really great, like very high quality, restaurant level quality samples. These were not sad little Costco samples. These were beautifully presented. It looked great, it had a great name, and it tasted fantastic. And once they were hooked by the great food, and everyone loves free food, then I could tell them more about the sustainability story, about why this is such a great choice. That was our first campaign, the first year of our existence. And then the pandemic hit. And we could no longer go to events or do any kind of in-person sampling. So we pivoted and decided we need to get our story out in a digital format. And we need to get a lot more video and photo content. I hired a young filmmaker who also happens to have a marine science degree, so he understands what he's talking about. And I sent him on a big road trip, all the way from San Diego, all the way up to Seattle and back. And along the way would meet, interesting people that work in our fishery. All the fantastic faces, the chefs, the scientists, the artists, and everyone would be able to tell their stories. We would film them, and basically that started what is now like a mini documentary series. And, yes, we also record great recipe video demonstrations and that kind of stuff. And that was a real blessing. So that meant we started our social media. YouTube is actually our biggest thing now. And the reach that we can have with that is far outweighs anything we could have done with events and sampling, etc.
That's amazing. You started out as kind of a guerrilla marketing campaign, like taking it to the streets, and then you pivoted to the new age of digital influencing. That's amazing. Basically,
and what's important to us there is that it's never really us that's on camera. It's not about us. It's not about Positively Groundfish at all. In fact, I don't care if people know our name, to be honest. I want them to know the names of the species. And I want to highlight all of the fantastic people that are doing the right thing, all of the great restaurants and chefs that really take an interest in highlighting local species. Those are the ones I want to shine a light on, and that I want more and more people to go to. So I spend our marketing dollars on promoting them. And that has actually been an approach that allowed us to make friends all along the West Coast and create a sense of we're all in this together, we're doing this together, we're moving forward in the same direction, and create a sense of momentum.
Yeah, you're directly supporting the community that is trying to support the fishery, so thereby creating that loop.
Yeah, and we try to stay on sort of the fun and positive emotional side. I mean, that's why we're called Positively Groundfish, right? Because we don't believe in the wagging finger of sustainability, like guilting people into buying things just because they're sustainable. So showcasing all of these fun, great people that are working in our fishery and letting them speak has kind of been our recipe for success.
And I will say, your videos, the videos on your website, they're gorgeous. It's just everything I've seen looks so well composed, including the recipes on your site, which I looked at some right before lunch, and I don't recommend that unless you have the ability to go out and get yourself some fresh groundfish. It was very frustrating. Do you have any favorite recipes?
I mean, when it comes to like black cod, sablefish, right, is an absolute favorite. Such an indulgent, buttery, beautiful fish. Highest omega-3 content of any fish, seafood out there. So it's also healthy for you. But a simple smoked black cod, just like that, with nothing else, beats a smoked salmon any day, in my opinion. Obviously, Nobu miso black cod, classic, beautiful, cannot go wrong with that. Rockfish is all about being versatile. It is such a clean, mild, white fish, great texture, and you can pretty much do anything with it, but we love showcasing it as a crudo, just like raw, with a couple of beautiful flavors on there, and people are just gobsmacked with that.
Jana Hennig, thanks so much for talking with me.
You're welcome. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share our story.
Jana Hennig is the executive director of Positively Groundfish, a nonprofit collaborative and recipient of the Saltonstall-Kennedy Grant. If you want to see some of the videos Jana was talking about, visit their site, positivelygroundfish.org. And if you want to support the fishing communities that work so hard to rebuild stocks and ensure sustainable harvest, ask your favorite retailer if they carry West Coast groundfish and other U.S. harvested species. And as always, you can learn more about the SK Grant or anything about groundfish, really, at fisheries.noaa.gov. I'm John Sheehan, and this has been Dive In with NOAA Fisheries.